They're now moving equipment. They're threatening that the peace agreement that has stood for decades between Egypt and Israel is at risk if they go into Rafah. The stakes are so tremendously high here. It's hard to compare to anything that has happened before.
There's growing international pressure on Israel over its planned offensive on Rafah, the city in southern Gaza, where hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees have gone seeking safety. The UK Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, has called for an immediate pause in fighting, pointing out that over half of Gaza's population are sheltering in the area. Saudi Arabia has warned of very serious repercussions if Rafah is stormed. Zach Anders joins us. He's a journalist in Tel Aviv this morning. Zach, good morning.
Hi, good morning.
First of all, then, just to note the kind of international pressure, the international criticism. Lord Cameron, the Foreign Secretary in the UK, saying, "I'm deeply concerned about the prospect of a military offensive in Rafah." He notes that over half of Gaza's population are sheltering there. The priority must be an immediate pause in the fighting to get aid in and hostages out, then progress towards a sustainable, permanent ceasefire. The international pressure is virtually unanimous, Zach. Is that changing the direction of Israel at this point?
It doesn't appear to be. I can start by putting this in context about urban warfare that has taken place in the last few decades and what's taken place in comparison with Gaza. In Grozny in the 90s, 25,000 people were killed in a city of 400,000 in 4 months of fighting. In Mosul, Iraq in 2016, 9,000 dead. In Aleppo, Syria, 35 to 45,000 dead. This is already what's happened in Gaza become one of the most deadly urban campaigns that has taken place in recent times. The main difference between those places, those cities, and Gaza is that people had somewhere to flee. They fled into the countryside and they could get away. Here, they cannot. And from the very beginning, the IDF has told these people to move to Rafah. This is the original safe zone. So they did. It's grown to over 1 million people that are in this dense area now, and it's a very tight situation. That's the only place that we can see that the aid is getting in consistently. Into the north of the Gaza Strip, we're still seeing that no aid is making its way to the northernmost areas, and that people that have remained are starving at risk of famine. The move into Rafah, even the most imaginative of commentators here in the country, cannot describe what this is going to look like when the IDF at its current force level, after fighting in Khan Yunis, which was not an easy fight and it's still not over, how they're going to mobilize into the Rafah area around 1 million people, 1 million civilians, and engage with Hamas inside another urban dense environment right against the border. We've seen Egypt react as they anticipate potentially they would have to either defend that border fence, which they've been building new layers to try and prevent any flow of people to go through the fence itself. They're now moving equipment. They're threatening that the peace agreement that has stood for decades between Egypt and Israel is at risk if they go into Rafah. The stakes are so tremendously high here. It's hard to compare to anything that has happened before.
Is there any sense, Zach, that the IDF's sort of stated ambitions and strategy in moving through Gaza is nearing any sort of conclusion? They've been talking about, exterminating Hamas fighters basically since the start of all of this in October. Is there any sense that they feel like they are nearing a conclusion? We've witnessed them, as you outlined, moving from north to south, and in theory, that could suggest there's a culmination coming and an end is in sight. Is that fair to say, or is that far from reality?
The end here is far from reality, but potentially the collapse of the structure and leadership of Hamas is closer to happening. The ability for them to fight in what the IDF has been describing is that they've eliminated 18 of the 24 Hamas battalions operating inside Gaza, and they continue to say that they've done significant damage to the leadership and the command structure, their ability to recollect and regroup and fight as a cohesive army against the IDF. A bit of a David and Goliath fight already. What now is the attention is you have essentially those who have escaped. What they're arguing, what the IDF is arguing, is that Um, there are Hamas fighters that have survived. They've gone into the Rafah area and they're awaiting the ability, or they have been regrouping and attempting to rearm. Ammunition and weapons being probably at this stage for them a serious issue that they are running low, so they wouldn't be able to put up a sizable fight. But they're putting Rafah again as this last stand of Hamas. If they go into Rafah, it's hard to imagine what the fighting will look like. Again, they continue to say that they're going to use, the IDF says that Hamas is going to use the civilian population as a shield, and that they've moved considerable resources and fighters into this area now in anticipation of that.
Mm. Elsewhere, then, Zach, let's reflect some of the other activity of the last couple of days. And Israeli strikes have been continuing on Lebanon's southern border as recently as yesterday.
And as some of these strikes are taking place very, very deep inside Lebanon, one of them about 20 miles south of Beirut. We'll remember on January 2nd, after New Year's, there was a strike on Hamas leader Saleh al-Aruri, who was killed in Beirut, along with some other Hamas and Hezbollah officials. But the IDF said that, the IDF didn't say anything in this particular instance. They have not been commenting or taking official responsibility for the strikes that are taking place against Hamas and Hezbollah inside Lebanon when they're targeting senior officials. Yesterday, we saw in the strike about 20 miles south of Beirut, it was believed a Hamas official. This, though, was reported as not the intended target, was not killed. And sources that I spoke to still have not been able to determine if the intended target was killed. They say it was a Hamas leader who was responsible for recruiting inside Lebanon and inside the West Bank. And the strike taking place on a car, killing bystanders on the road, and apparently a Hezbollah member that was inside the car. But the fate of the Hamas intended target is unknown. The real interesting part, though, of yesterday was the Iranian foreign minister in Beirut met with Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, and said that that both Tehran and Beirut agree that a wider war is not in their interests. This is interesting enough because the conflict in the north often escapes the headlines. But what Hezbollah has done is they've fired on the northern communities that have been mostly evacuated. About 80,000 Israeli civilians have evacuated from this area. They have not attempted, even though they have the weapons in their arsenal with range, to strike much deeper inside Israel. They have contained most of this fighting to the northern border. And they're signaling in their own way that the escalation would not be in their interest. And it really wouldn't inside Lebanon. As many as 100,000 people are displaced inside southern Lebanon. And the IDF is laying waste to some of these border communities with the airstrikes as they target Hezbollah. So interesting to see after the Iranian foreign minister visit in Beirut, these comments.
Zach, thank you very much. Thank you for speaking to us. It's good to have you on. That's Zach Anders, a journalist reporting from Tel Aviv this morning. Lots then to consider. I wonder if this will keep moving today after Lord Cameron's tweet last night saying the priority must be an immediate pause in the fighting to get aid in and hostages out, then progress towards a sustainable permanent ceasefire. And like I say, the kind of criticism of the ramping up of a potential move on Rafah has been pretty widespread. US President Joe Biden saying there are a lot of innocent people who are starving, a lot of innocent people who are in trouble and dying. It's got to stop. And so the criticism coming from all sides, but whether that puts the brakes on Israel's stated intentions remains to be seen.